World War II is often lauded as a battle where the forces of good were triumphant over evil, a conflict that produced many tales of heroism that told of the endurance of the human spirit. Till this day we live in the aftermath of this enormous event. The soldiers would return back to their countries as heroes with parades to honor their sacrifices. However, this couldn't be further from the reality of the Vietnam veterans. There were no victory parades or welcome home rallies. Instead, most returned to a society that did not care about them, that saw them as part of the problem, and not a physical or emotional casualty of a conflict that was thrusted upon them. Due to the anti-war movement at the time, a lot of protesters had developed a deep resentment towards the returning soldiers. Many of the young men who fought in Vietnam had a hard time adjusting to life back in the US. Some struggled to overcome their physical injuries. The emotional pain often led to a crippling drug addiction inherited from the jungles of Vietnam. Others even had trouble being accepted by their friends and their family. They would return back from there, different people than when they left. What has inspired me to write on this subject was a man nicknamed Blaze that I worked with a few years back. In my late teens at the time, I would curiously ask him about what he saw and what he experienced. Probably seeing me as a bright-eyed dumb kid, he was kind enough to share with me his war stories and would even tell me about his heroin addiction that plagued him for numerous years after. So in honor of him, I present to you guys this video. The Vietnam War was a prolonged struggle to unify the country of Vietnam under communism. In an attempt to prevent it, the United States would engage in a full-out war with the North Vietnamese, also known as the Viet Congs. Fully dedicated to their Cold War foreign policy of containment, halting the spread of communism throughout the world is vital at the time. This fear of communism was heightened by the domino theory, that if any country were to fall victim to it, the surrounding countries would soon follow. Over time, the United States drastically escalated its participation in the Vietnam War, expanding its military presence from a few hundred to hundreds of thousands. Despite its cost, they felt it was important to persevere in the interests of peace and progress in the Pacific. Throughout this conflict, there would be over 1 million Vietnamese and American casualties. Like any war, the working class men are always its first casualty. Over 80% of the 27 million men who reached draft age during the war came from impoverished backgrounds. Unlike World War II, whose vast scale demanded a mobilization of all social classes, Vietnam was more limited and determined to channel the upper-class youth away from combat. This was done through a variety of methods. such as student deferments, paying off doctors to declare you unfit, and connections to get you desk jobs. Once the Vietnam War was in full effect, men who were seen as draft prone were often turned down from jobs because employers did not want to train a worker only to have him drafted soon after. This created an environment where the military seemed to be the only thing that they could do with their lives. Upon arriving to the Nam, as many experienced soldiers called it, the new recruits would be faced with a baptism of fire, tested by their hardened peers who had already seen numerous of their comrades killed. A sense of dread would usually overtake them in their first months. The spontaneous nature of the enemy would mean letting your guard down at any time could be your demise. This sort of trauma would induce many into shell shock and trances that would lead them to begin to self-medicate with whatever illicit drug they could find. Related also was the growing disenchantment with the war and the progressive deterioration in unit morale. By the time the war was over, they would return unable to find any decent jobs, and with a heroin addiction that had to be fed in some way. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse as the nation's #1 public health problem. By September of that year, 20% of the enlisted men in the army had become addicted to heroin or opium, and about 50% had at least tried it while they were there.
To keep myself going through the day in combat, I would get high. I would be under the influence of some type of drugs, and I wouldn't feel fear.
I was driving a motor vehicle. So I said, what that mean? I did 3 tours over there, 2 voluntary tours. You didn't say nothing about that little infraction when I was over there fighting, killing people.
Seeing him dead, laying on the ground the next morning, it really stayed on my mind. So I started using drugs.
Score's not high enough, but my score was high enough to do 3 years in Nam.
Hey, Jack, you were there. You got wounded 3 times, twice or whatever it was.
Last time I got hit in the head. We had 57 killed and 140 wounded. And like my whole platoon was completely wiped out except for about 3 or 4 guys.
Much of the stress also came from some of the incredibly dangerous jobs that an individual could be tasked with. None more deadly than the tunnel rat. The tunnels were the lifeblood of the Viet Cong. Being able to appear and disappear from the tunnels, they could ambush entire platoons. Even air raids and mortar strikes were useless against it. To give the US troops any chance of winning, the devastating effect of this strategy had to be negated. They tried to send dogs first, but the dogs were unable to detect any booby traps, and gas or explosives would destroy the intel. This made them recruit smaller men for this job, requiring them to be under 5'6" in order to be considered eligible. The job was so dangerous that you could not be ordered, you had to volunteer. The tunnels were a terrifying place to find yourself in, with no way of seeing anything in front of you, leading to the possibility of the enemy being right in your midst. However, encountering the enemy wouldn't be considered the worst thing happening to these individuals. It was when they would step on a booby trap, causing the tunnel to collapse, which meant you would end up trapped underneath the remains of the tunnel. This job required a special kind of mental toughness. It involved crawling hours on end in a claustrophobic darkness, expecting fatal danger. It could break down even the bravest of men. Private First Class Nelson Ritter, a combat infantryman who became a tunnel rat, was once quoted saying, "The Viet Cong were acclimated to the darkness. We were in broad daylight descending into it." Vietnam offered many different forms of danger. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States began paying helicopter pilots a bonus of $100 to $150 on top of their regular salaries. This was intended to compensate pilots for the incredible risks they faced while flying. The average life expectancy of a U.S. Army pilot in combat was only 19 minutes. Having this responsibility of rescuing men out of hectic situations required someone with a lot of guts and brains. It's unfortunate that much of the focus is not on the bravery that many men had to fight for their country. They committed the ultimate sacrifice for what they believed was right. The homage does not only go to them, but to the Vietnamese people who had to endure the onset of a brutal catastrophe. No matter where you found yourself at in Vietnam at the time, it would have been a dreadful experience. All this contributed to the trauma that would leave many scarred for years after their tour. They would leave the Nam, but the Nam wouldn't leave them. These experiences would plague Vietnam veterans for the entirety of their lives. Many would struggle with nightmares and flashbacks that made it very difficult to incorporate themselves back into society as they once did. It was something that the general population would simply just never understand. Even the vets of the Second World War didn't feel the exhaustion that the Vietnam guys felt. Due to Vietnam being smaller in terrain, troops would be in more frequent firefights at any moment. It is often said, 1 year in Nam was 24 in the outside world. After all the pain and suffering that was experienced during combat, the men would return to a world that did not know them anymore. Instead of embracing them, a cold shoulder was all they got for their trouble. For any lucky serviceman that was shipped back home after surviving their tour, another young kid was being shipped the other way around. As the war dragged on endlessly for almost 10 years, it became clear the Viet Cong were just not going to surrender. It became more and more hopeless as the military higher-ups put through a revolving door of soldiers. Many saw it as America stubbornly not wanting to accept defeat. It would be the first major war loss in US history. As more and more distrust was placed upon the United States government, Vietnam vets would receive more and more national implication of guilt and shame. I hope that everyone who had the misfortune of being a part of this deadly catastrophe of a war is able to find peace in the life to come. For the many family members who lost someone both physically or mentally on both sides, that the legacy of the men and women who perished during the Vietnam War may be honored in their lives, and that we may all find peace in this troubling time. Once again, I've been Jesse. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.